such interesting and thoughtful and well-presented presentations. But I don't want to just respond to them, even though there's so much richness, except just really briefly to say first to Jeremy, on your point about people on the left who want the creation of a Palestinian state on most of the West Bank to recognize the historic Jewish attachment to the land that we call the West Bank and the pain of giving up sovereignty over it, you are absolutely right. I think it's a very, very important critique of the left that I just want to second. And I think it's something that the left does not do a good job of. And especially talking to people who are more religious, to recognizing, I can read Bereshit as well as anybody else, the depth of the historic Jewish attachment to places like Hebron and Shechem and Bethlehem is profound. And even though they may be willing, we may be willing to lose sovereignty over them in order to maintain Israel's existence as a democratic Jewish state, I think it's important to recognize that pain. So I think you've done a good thing by calling that out. Melissa, I guess I would just say, in response to your kind of thought-provoking challenge, that I think, with all due respect, you and I are in different businesses. You are a Jewish professional who does quiet diplomacy. Yasher koach. There's a reason that I praised Encounter in my most recent piece in the New York Review Books, and that I will continue to praise it because I think you do wonderful, wonderful work based on quiet conversations with people in ways that don't cause them any public discomfort. I'm a writer. If you're a writer, you have one fundamental overriding obligation, and if you don't live up to it, you should get out of the writing business. It's to be true to what you believe is correct. That is your fundamental obligation, whether people like it or not. The important thing is that you believe it's true. It may not be true, but the important thing is that you believe to the depths of your being that it's true. And I would say, with all due respect, that if you look for movements of social change that have taken place throughout American history and throughout the history of the Jewish people, none have succeeded with only your way. They have all required the combination of people who are doing what you're doing and people who are doing what I'm doing. And so I think they're both necessary. I want to say, first of all, to just speak from my personal experience, I don't feel like I've been censored. There's no constitutional obligation for anyone to invite me to speak if they don't want to hear what I have to say. I have the right to write and have my views published. My parents grew up in apartheid South Africa. I know what it means to grow up and live in a place where you're censored. I am not censored. It's true. Sometimes I get unpleasant emails. So for instance, when I turned on my cell phone after Yom Kippur, I came across an email from a man who said, you self-hating Jew cocksucker, I wish you would die. And I thought, when did he send that email? Because, I don't want to be self-congratulatory, but I've been in shul. So it turned out that it was sent at 8:39 on Friday night. And so I sent him an email back and I said, look, I don't want to be judgmental. I can think of better ways to spell in the Kol Nidre. But that's not censorship. That's just an email that you would prefer to not get when you've been trying to repent. Although it's always nice to know that there are others who may have more to repent for than you. Just a couple of points. This has been about the inter-Jewish communal conversation, and that's important. But I don't think that you can have an intelligent conversation about Israel without including 50% of the people who live under Israeli control who are Palestinians. And I say that not only because we have a moral obligation to listen to Palestinians and recognize their dignity and humanity. I'm saying it from also the narrowest of Jewish self-interest. There was a time when Jews were very good at understanding what the peoples who lived around us thought of us. We had to be good at it because our survival depended on it. When we were weak, we were pretty smart about understanding what the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians thought. Now that we are relatively powerful, we have the luxury of not feeling like we need to understand often what Palestinians think. But that's very dangerous. Ignorance is ultimately the road to losing the power you have. And I have to say, it frightens me. It frightens me when I talk to young Palestinians and I realize how knowledgeable they are about the Jewish and Zionist conversation. And I talk to really smart young American Jewish kids who, because of the environment in which they've grown up, have never read a book by a Palestinian, don't know the basic fundamentals of the Palestinian narrative. And I think a number of things, but from the most narrow tribal perspective, I think we're going to lose this intellectual encounter because Palestinians understand what we think, they hear it all around them, and we don't know what they're saying, which is dangerous from in the narrowest of self-interested terms. I think and so in some ways, I guess, to Jeremy's point that boundaries are legitimate, I would say yes, boundaries are legitimate. The question to me is, are they smart? And if you want to have Palestinians you want to have a conversation with Palestinians, you're going to have to accept that maybe a dirty little secret, but most Palestinians are not Zionists. And so the red lines that we established are simply, it is simply not realistic to expect that Palestinians are going to live within the red lines that have been established by a Jewish community which has a Zionist consensus. I wouldn't expect them to. And so the de facto, the rules that are established, whether you say democratic and Jewish secure Israel, I'm all with you. That's what I want too. But in de facto, you are preventing Palestinians from coming into the conversation because Palestinians don't think overwhelmingly that having a Jewish state is a good idea. That's a very challenging and difficult thing for those of us to deal with. Some ways more difficult for those of us on the left, frankly, than for those of us on the right. But it's a reality, and we need to hear it and understand it to be able to respond to it effectively, I think. I also think that part of the problem with this idea of democratic and Jewish state is that if you're really only going to allow people who believe in a democratic and Jewish state to come and speak at your organization, you have to be as machmir on the democratic side as you are on the Jewish side. So if you say that Jewish voices of peace isn't acceptable because they have ambivalence about the idea of a Jewish state, then it seems to me you should have real questions about Zionist Organization for America, American Friends of the Good, and a whole series of organizations that, as far as I can tell, essentially want permanent Israeli control over territories in which Palestinians lack citizenship, the right to vote, and due process, and free movement, which is a grave threat to Israel's democratic character. So the problem is, you're going to have a very narrow conversation if you really want to be strict on both ends. And so I actually think it's better to be looser on both ends and to let people on the right and people on the left come as well. I also think that part of, oddly enough, what the limitations on the discourse do is they really degrade and cheapen our discussion of Zionism. Because in some ways, the irony of ironies is that Zionism itself does not respect the red lines that have been drawn by the American Jewish community. Zionism, a fascinating intellectual enterprise, a fascinating piece of Jewish history about which we know, I think we as a community know far too little, cannot be encapsulated by the phrase secure, democratic, and Jewish state. Ahad Ha'am, from my point of view, did not want a secure, democratic Jewish state. There is a whole tradition of cultural Zionism. I mean, I should say, I'm a political Zionist. I want a Jewish state. But there's a whole rich, fascinating tradition of Zionism, which is non-statist, which thought about the importance of a Jewish presence in the land of Israel to radiate throughout the Jewish world, which didn't necessarily want it to take state form. My point is not to advocate for that. I wouldn't advocate for it. The point is that you're actually limiting the discussion of Zionism itself if a devotee of Ahad Ha'am can't be part of the conversation. And the last point, and I'll stop there, is that if you're going to say that people whose tactics undermine Israel's legitimacy can't be part of the conversation, then I think we have to recognize that BDS is not the only kind of tactic that can undermine Israel's legitimacy. Having the 5 municipalities in the state of Israel that receive the most government money all being in the West Bank, so you are essentially paying people to leave what I call democratic Israel and move to non-democratic Israel. As far as I can tell, that really undermines Israel's legitimacy, because ultimately Israel's legitimacy, especially in the eyes of the world, rests on the same foundation as the legitimacy of any government and political system in today's world, and that is its democratic credentials. And if you undermine those democratic credentials, you, to my mind, are doing more to damage Israel's legitimacy, even than the people who talk about full boycott, divestment, sanction, which I oppose. Then the last point I would say is, if Zionism is bigger than a secure democratic Jewish state, it's also really important for us to remember that Judaism is bigger than Zionism. And I think the thing that, I say this as a political Zionist, we have not done a great job in the American Jewish community of inculcating love of, joy in, and fascination with Judaism to young American Jews. We are perhaps the wealthiest and most Judaically ignorant Jewish community, large Jewish community in the history of the world. And in that context, it frightens me to think that we would set up barriers to people's access to Jewish engagement and love and knowledge and learning because they fell outside those boundaries. We really can't afford to do that, it seems to me. And that's why I think that taking the risks of a broader and open conversation is ultimately going to be in the interest of the state of Israel, in the interest of the Zionist project, and I think ultimately in the interest of the continuation of Jewish life in the United States.